Hi, I'm Moji Alawodeyal from the Feminist Buzzkills Live Pod, the only podcast that helps you navigate the news in this post-Roe anti-abortion hellscape. Each week, with co-host Liz Winstead, we dissect all the news from that sketchy intersection of abortion and misogyny with providers and activists working on the ground. The cherry on top is we have amazing comedy guests who help us laugh through the rage. Feminist Buzzkills Live drops Fridays wherever you pod. Listen and subscribe, because when BS is popping, we pop off.
Our press secretary gave alternative facts to that.
My goal in this deposition was to be truthful, but not particularly helpful.
Welcome to UnSpun, the podcast that makes you better at finding the truth. The way people get news is changing. It used to be that there were many reporters who would research stories and write articles, but now politicians and famous people share information directly with you on social media and the internet. That means you find out things fast, but it's up to you to make sure the information's actually accurate. And newsmakers don't always do their part. The temptation to manipulate information is strong. They bend the truth to deceive so that they can avoid accountability, so that they can advance their agendas. When you recognize these agendas, you can sometimes find out what's real. And we're at a crossroads where anyone can share anything online, so it's important to sharpen your critical thinking skills. Finding that deception before it goes viral is pretty much a survival skill now, and we're going to do it together. Let's get unspun. Hey, truth seekers, and welcome to this week's episode of the UnSpun Journal Club. I wanted to start this week with a clip from a government conference from the White House Deputy Chief of Staff, Stephen Miller. And as you listen, pay attention to his wording here.
The leftist looks at what is beautiful and what is good and what is natural and is filled with envy and hatred. The leftist looks at a perfect family with a perfect life and a perfect job and perfect kids that goes to church every Sunday and is filled with a feeling of inadequacy and jealousy, and they covet, and they turn those emotions ultimately into a desire to subjugate, to oppress, and to inflict pain and suffering. It's not a coincidence that when you look at these violent Antifa demonstrations, you see any photograph of those who were assembled. To be blunt, not one of the people that is demonstrating looks like a normal person. Not one looks normal. They're all deformed in some way, in their appearance, in their dress, in their mannerism. When it comes to preventing these horrors, it is the burden and the duty of good people of all walks of life to understand that you will always be accused of raising the alarm too loudly. If you wait until the point where the worst outcome is so obvious that no one can deny it, you've already lost the battle. That's the fundamental point. If you say, I will not raise this alarm until the threat is so present and so clear and so obvious and so imminent that none can deny it, it's already too late. It's already too late. I would rather prevent a threat from occurring and be accused for the rest of my life of having falsely raised the alarm, knowing in myself that I was right, than for fear of being judged having waited too long until the point of no return has been crossed.
There are two words that I would pull out here that he said because I think he chose them very deliberately. He's speaking about people who confront ICE officers, right? And so statistics from the Department of Homeland Security suggest that there's been a more than 1,000% increase in what they called violent assaults. But I would note that independent analyses from news organizations like the LA Times and the New York Times found that that number is inflated because it includes people who are protesting, who are yelling at officers or, doing other things that wouldn't actually injure anybody but are categorized as violent. So in the clip that I played, Miller sets up a dichotomy between people he calls perfect, which he defines as beautiful, good, and natural. And he says this includes families with children who go to church. And he said you can look at photos of protesters, and he says, quote, not one of the people that is demonstrating looks like a normal person. Not one looks normal. So in his words, we have perfect and normal, and then we have people who protest. And he goes on to tell the audience that they can easily see that outsider, the abnormal person. This kind of rhetoric has a purpose. And the purpose is for you, the listener, to start seeing some of the people in your own world as less than human. And that is really, really dangerous. It's kind of similar to what the Nazis did when they called Jews and Roma people Untermenschen or subhuman. And, it went further under the Nazis than Miller is going right here with comparisons of people to parasites and diseases, all of which are things that we want to eradicate, right? So I would say that the effect here in Miller's speech is similar. It makes you see people who are not a nuclear church going family or, people who just go to protests, not as beautiful, good, or natural as he said. And my point of including this is for you to think about how you might respond when someone uses language like this. I will say that a lot of the negative social media response to Miller's statement was just personal attacks on him. Now, Miller is a little bit shorter than a lot of men in politics. He lost his hair fairly young and he is quite pale. People make a lot of negative comments about his appearance, and a lot of that showed up in people's reactions to his words here. Someone will share that clip of Stephen Miller, and even if they want to say Stephen Miller is bald or whatever, when they do that, they're still putting his words in front of their audience. And rather than doing that, rather than engaging in that good versus evil conflict that Miller himself is setting up, I think there is a better way. That better way is to get a picture of the humanity of the people Miller is talking about in front of your own audience. Pointing out, for example, the fact that Alex Preddy had a job or that Renee Good had children. Even under Miller's own definitions, that should be normal. That's better than sharing a message that's just combative because you get a chance to combat a bad message with something positive. And you should consider that that is more likely to get through to people who don't already agree with you. Okay, let's go on to this week's article. I look at a lot of news, and one thing I've noticed lately is that news just doesn't seem as newsy as it used to be. I teach in journalism, and in our buildings, we have TVs that play cable news all the time. And it kind of low key amazes me that the subject of news reports and interviews and panel commentary or whatever will be the same story for 48 hours. And the whole time it's carrying this red breaking news banner. And it's not just cable. If you take a newspaper, you've probably noticed it's very, very thin now. And if you watch the news on TV, you might also notice more ads or more human interest stories. On social media, little snippets of facts that you see aren't around for very long, but they're also not complete or put in any kind of context. And so I really feel like we are in a media flood, but an information drought at the same time. And so that's the topic of this week's UnSpun Journal Club paper. Let's find out more. Let's get unspun. The paper is called No News is Good News? The Declining Information Value of Broadcast News in America, and it's from Johann Gabler and colleagues. The paper was published in 2025, and it noted that broadcast news is actually still a really common way for people to find out what's going on. The writers also say that media critics have been doing their job and criticizing broadcast news for its weak content. And that's true. You do see a lot of stories about movie stars and about scandals, but you also see less about important social issues like hunger or employment. And this can be a problem for democracy because citizens need to know what's going on in their world in order to effectively elect leaders who can help make things better. The authors note that even when broadcast news networks, your CBS or your NBC, for example, do cover politics, they're usually covering things like poll stories or stories about campaign strategy. And this kind of coverage is notably not what a candidate says they would do about an important issue, and whether what the candidate says they would do would actually work. So, what has changed in TV news? That's what the writers went out to find. And they point out several different trends. One of them is the 24-hour news cycle that has kind of come over from cable news. And in that, you need to be consistently redirecting your audience's attention, always giving them a reason to stay there so that they see your ads and you make money. At the same time, some of those cable news outlets are very politically biased. And then we also have second screening. This is where people are consuming two forms of information at the same time. For example, looking at the news on social media while having the TV on in the background. And you see TV news trying to accommodate for this by doing things like asking the audience to interact with the news platform by maybe tagging the station in a social media post, which they might then show on television. Another thing is a real slip of trust in the media themselves. As media has tried to be responsive to the market by becoming sensationalist and partisan, that's made large parts of the audience not trust them. And this is especially true for younger people. In fact, if you watch a network news evening broadcast on TV, you can tell from the type of advertising that they know who their audience is and that their audience tends to be old. They don't discuss this in the paper, but there is another factor because other researchers suggested that different kinds of people get information in different ways. In the US, which is where they did the study, there has been research that's shown that Black Americans are much more likely to get their news from television than are Hispanic or white Americans. And there's even more than that, because Black Americans are also significantly more likely to follow local news outlets than are white and Hispanic viewers. So if TV news is changing, it may affect people in the audience differently based on those people's characteristics. One thing to know about studying television or any video form of media is that it has been really hard because it is what's called a time based medium, or in other words, it happens over time. So think about it. If you wanted to catalog everything that was broadcast on a 24-hour news network for a month, that's more than 600 hours of content you would have to watch. And if you just want to know basic things like what content was panel shows and what was opinion shows, that wouldn't be too bad. But how about if you wanted to study something like the types of sources that were used for the news? You're then having to code at a fairly detailed level. And although you don't have to watch it at one time speed, there's still a limit to how fast you as a human can do that. In fact, over my career, I've spent a lot of time advising students that this kind of analysis for video is not really plausible for something like a semester long project because it just takes too long. But today, technology may be giving us some help. You've been able to use computers to categorize content for a while now, and this study took it a little bit further. As a little aside, you might be interested to know that Vanderbilt University has been keeping a database of TV news going all the way back to the 1960s. You're welcome to have a look for yourself, and I will put a link in the show notes for you. And it can be pretty fun. You can do things like use Jeffrey Epstein as a search term and see how much each network covered him in terms of number of stories or number of minutes or whatever over time. Gabler and team wanted to answer a bigger question, though, about the change in broadcast news overall, over the whole time the database has been put together. So when news broadcasts go into this archive, there's a summary of the episode and there's a title like Prince Andrew's Sex Scandal that tells you what the segment is about. And these researchers wanted to look at a whole bunch of broadcasts, and those would have multiple millions of words in their scripts. So they developed a process using AI to help with the classification. They ended up categorizing through a repeated process into large super topics like business news, foreign politics, transportation disasters, and things like that. So, what did they find? I'm going to take a very quick break and then we'll go through the results. I'll be right back. Welcome back. Okay, so the paper categorized broadcast TV news over a period of more than 50 years, and all in all, findings were not great. Most evening news broadcasts are 30 minutes long, and over that 30-minute broadcast, the time for advertising has pretty much doubled. The time given to important news dropped from 20 minutes of a newscast to about 12. And the thing that was even more concerning was it tended to be in particular topic areas. So where do we see things drop a lot? The biggest area was civil rights and social movements, which, coming from the 1960s, seems like it might make sense since a lot changed in U.S. society after that. In the 60s and 70s, those civil rights stories represented 15 to 20% of the news. But by the mid-2020s, it was down closer to 2%. International coverage has also gone down, which is something I talked about in a previous UnSpun episode. Generally, the economics of international reporting encouraged major news outlets to pull back on coverage. There were some winners, too. Reporting on natural disasters increased a great deal, from less than 2% to averaging more to like 10 to 15. And culture and entertainment has always been relatively small, but it did come to take more of the news minutes over time. Now, the authors credit economics with the overall shift in news coverage. Broadcasters are supposed to act in the public interest. So these are, again, network broadcasters like your ABC, NBC, CBS. And I'm going to go into that public interest mission a whole lot more in next week's episode. But just know that operating in the public interest means that you get the right to use the finite electromagnetic spectrum as long as you're doing something that's going to benefit society. And what this used to mean was that they invested in their news operations because it was the right thing to do. But over time, you've seen converging ownership, which means that you have multi-focused conglomerates who are owning news networks, among other things, and they're looking for everything on the broadcast network to be profitable, including the news division. NBC is owned by Comcast, which also owns streaming services, a broadband provider, and several amusement parks. Walt Disney owns ABC, which also owns cruise ships, Mickey Mouse merchandise, and a whole lot of other stuff. And there's a company called National Amusement that owns Paramount Skydance, which owns CBS. You get the idea. These are big, multifaceted companies with shareholders. And when you have shareholders, profits matter a lot. News is not very profitable. The decisions networks make matter too for all of us. The researchers looked at the amount of time in a newscast that was devoted to national political issues, the kind of things we would think about as we're choosing leaders. And the analysis found that in the 1960s, that was 19 minutes of the 30-minute broadcast. And today, it is half of that. I'm going to put a link to the original paper in the show notes, and I would encourage you to have a look because there's some really good figures in there that show what it is that we are losing. And speaking of losing, when you have this kind of loss of coverage, all of us in a civil society are losing something. Now, you might think it doesn't matter to me because I don't watch newscasts. And speaking personally, I know I haven't really sat down and consistently watched evening news in many years. Like I said at the beginning, it's mostly old people who do that at this point. However, if you see clips in your social media, if you see them shown in a congressional hearing, or if it's in that email that your grandma forwards to you, those came from that broadcast news because they were there to follow an issue over time, to ask hard questions at press conferences, to show the damage or to interview the people who were affected by something, and they preserve all the things that they find. And ultimately, no matter how you see it, that preservation is going to matter to you. And it's especially important when you're getting more misinformation in your information. There are studies that have been done in multiple countries that show that Americans are just more ignorant overall about what's going on in the world. And if we have fewer news outlets and they're covering less news, that's going to be some of why. When people are ignorant, they're easier to manipulate. So, it's not a surprise that a politician said that he loves the poorly educated. News is one way that we are able to educate ourselves, and it doesn't mean necessarily that you're tuning into that broadcast at the end of the day. You may be seeing parts of it in your other feeds. You may be using a search engine to go and look it up to verify something that you've seen, but that news does matter. And when the news gets less newsy, it impoverishes us all. Okay, so that's it for this week's UnSpun Journal Club. I'll be back in your ears next week, but until then, stay sharp, truth seekers. Thanks for getting unspun with me this week. Unspun is a production of me, Amanda Sturgill, and is a proud member of the MSW Media family of podcasts. Send me your thoughts and ideas about trickery in the news on Gmail at theunspunpodcast@gmail.com. I even write back. And find this episode's show notes and more information at theunspunpodcast.substack.com. Want to learn more and get smarter? Check out my book, Detecting Deception, Tools to Fight Fake News, which is available on Amazon or your favorite online bookseller. And until next time, stay sharp, everyone.
Hi, I'm Moji Alawodeal from the Feminist Buzzkills Live Pod, the only podcast that helps you navigate the news in this post-pro anti-abortion hellscape. Each week, with co-host Liz Winstead, we dissect all the news from that sketchy intersection of abortion and misogyny with providers and activists working on the ground. The cherry on top is we have amazing comedy guests who help us laugh through the rage. Feminist Buzzkills Live drops Fridays wherever you pod. Listen and subscribe, because when BS is popping, we pop off.